Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis Fraga, and I have the privilege of serving as director of the Institute for Latino Studies at Notre Dame, as well as being a professor of political science. It's wonderful that you're taking an hour of your Monday afternoon to share with us some magnificent material that you will be presented with today. The Institute for Latino Studies at Notre Dame has been proud for the last 3 years to sponsor Hispanic Heritage Month. Hispanic Heritage Month actually started in 1968 as a result of legislation introduced by Congressman Edward Roybal of California and signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. It wasn't until 1989 that a presidential proclamation of President George Herbert Walker Bush that Hispanic Heritage Month was established. Every president since then has recognized the contributions that Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx communities have made in the United States, and that's the purpose of Hispanic Heritage Month. But it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on the challenges still confronting our communities as it tries to further integrate itself into positions of importance, positions of leadership, positions of equality, and positions of contribution within our American society. Today, we have a magnificent opportunity to think about that in the presentations being made by individuals who will talk to us about Latinx presence and power, the 2020 census, and overcoming the politics of erasure. We all know how important the 2020 census is. We all know how controversial it has been for a number of months, certainly since the time when the Secretary of Commerce decided that a question regarding citizenship would or would not be included, which ultimately was not the case. Controversies regarding when the census would close, but there's no doubt that the census is important to our communities to make sure that we are appropriately counted, to make sure that we are there for purposes of political representation, and especially there for purposes of being counted for any sort of federal budgetary contribution that may come to our communities. To help us think about these issues, it is my pleasure to bring Michael Nicolas Okinczyc-Cruz, Executive Director and co-founder of the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership in Chicago. Michael has become a dear friend of mine and of the Institute for Latino Studies. The CSPL, as it is called, is a faith-based community organization, and Michael has at least 10 years of experience working to address issues related to criminal justice, mental health, corporate bank accountability, immigration reform, refugee rights, public transportation, and economic justice on a local, statewide, and national level. He has trained thousands of leaders to empower them to be able to move forward on their own. He has a BA from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's in theology from Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School, and a doctorate of ministry with a concentration in Latinx studies from Fordham University. He's a first-generation American, and his maternal grandparents were from Guanajuato, Mexico, and his father is a refugee from Poland. Michael lives in Chicago with his partner, Joanna. We also have one of our own, Kassandra Perez, a senior at the University of Notre Dame. She is majoring in mathematics with a supplemental major in Latino Studies. She lives in Indianapolis, Indiana now, or at least her family does, and she's an RA in Cavanaugh Hall. Kassandra was a remote intern with a Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership this summer, and she worked with the CSPL on their Census Committee and their Economic Justice Committee. It is my pleasure to present these two individuals to you, and we will begin with Michael. Michael?
Thank you, Dr. Fraga and everybody at ILS for inviting us today. Kassandra and I are thrilled to be with you. And Kassandra is going to kick off our part of the presentation first, explaining a little bit more about what the census is. So I'll hand it off to my partner and colleague here, Kassandra.
Thank you, Michael. So the census is due September 30th. That's why we really want to emphasize why it's important to turn it in as soon as possible if you haven't already. So just a quick overview of the census. The questions are very simple. I think there's a lot of confusion on the questions, but it just asks for your name, your age, your birth date, gender, and race and ethnicity. That's it. And then when we start to kind of look at why it's important for our Latinx communities, I just want to share a brief story. This summer, as Professor Fraga mentioned, I did a lot of phone banking for CSPL, and I was able to talk to a bunch of different people in the surrounding Chicago communities, places where I kind of grew up with, and a lot of the phone calls I did were in Spanish to our Latinx communities. And there was this one woman who I talked to. She had been in the States for many years, but she hadn't filled out the census, and she didn't know how to because she didn't get the form in the mail. She couldn't find it. And she lived in an apartment complex. So she said that a lot of the people in this apartment complex hadn't gotten this form. And then she didn't know how to use the computer. So she didn't know how to fill it out online because this is the first year you can fill out the census online. And she didn't have the phone number to call. So she was pretty much without a way to fill out the census. So I was able to walk her through that. But I was just kind of shocked at the fact that, because she was asking me, she's like, but why is the census important? And why should I fill it out? Oh, is it really that big of a deal if I don't fill it out, if everyone else is doing it? But when you start to think about it, if everyone's in that mindset that everyone else is going to fill it out, so I don't have to fill it out, there's such a huge impact, especially in our Latinx communities, when we don't fill out the census, because the data affects us for the next 10 years. And especially when you start to think about the Latinx population growth we've seen in the US. If you think about in 2010, the last time we filled out the census, we were at 50.7 million. And then now in 2019, we were at 60.6 million for our Latinx population here in the US. So just seeing how big that growth has been in these last couple years, we really want that reflected in the census, because that data, like I said, does affect us for the next 10 years. And this data, for one, it goes towards the representation in the government. So the census data is used to draw congressional and state legislative districts. It also affects the number of seats we have in the House of Representatives. And so when you think about the Latinx community, there's a big number of undocumented people, and there's also permanent residents. This is kind of a way for them to have a voice. I think sometimes people forget that they can't vote. So that really kind of hinders them having a voice in that way. And there's such a big emphasis on voting, but it's also equally important to fill out the census because it's not, regardless if you're documented or not, you are able to fill it out. And then going on to funding for our communities, the census data is used to see how government funding is going to be kind of provided to different districts. So billions of dollars in federal funding go to our hospitals, our fire departments, our schools and universities, help with roads, things like that. So again, that's directly going to affect us for 10 years. And then finally, the census data is used for business decisions. So business owners use this to make decisions on where they're going to open new stores, restaurants, factories, or offices, but also where they're going to recruit employees. And importantly, also which products and services they're going to offer. So sometimes I hear people say that there's a lot of stores near them, but they don't sell a lot of like Latino items and they're really missing out on certain things. That's why it's important to fill this out, because that way these businesses know the demographic that it exists in these communities and they can better serve these communities. So now to kind of continue on, Michael's going to talk about some of the major obstacles that the Latinx community faces in regards to the census.
Thank you so much, Kassandra. And thank you for putting that all so succinctly. I want to start with the story. So at CSPL, we've done a lot of work over the last 6 to 9 months on the census, perhaps even longer. And I've got to lift up Rose Ocampo, Maria Franco, Meg Miller, Rosette Momboleo, Maria Marquez, Sue Ross, Anneli Jaime, all the incredible leaders, Lula, Ana Sanchez. I could keep going and going, but all the remarkable leaders who've done so much on the census approaching the last year now. Not only beginning well before it was time to start counting people with educational work and building a committee, but throughout the pandemic, working tirelessly during a profoundly difficult time. And as I think about Hispanic Heritage Month, I think about their tireless efforts, their commitment, their resolve, their faith, their courage to make sure that our communities are adequately counted in this 2020 census. And it hasn't been easy. In fact, it's been harder than I think any of us could have anticipated. None of us expected to be going through what we've been going through the last 6 months since mid-April and even before. And even if we take out the pandemic from this moment that we're in, this political crisis that we're in would be enough of a hurdle to make this a profoundly challenging time to do the work that we're doing. And so there's a story that comes to mind in the midst of so many stories. But a few months ago, we were at a census event in Melrose Park, which is a village, a predominantly Latinx populated village outside of the city of Chicago. And we were there at a parish. It was an event specifically set up for the census, and we were there in partnership with this parish in Melrose Park. And we were there on a weekend giving out food and encouraging people to fill out the census. And I remember I saw a guy, we were in the parking lot of the parish because we were trying to do everything as much as we could outdoors. And I saw this guy walking down the street, and I ran over to him and I tried to talk to him about the census. And he looked at me and he was so visibly angry. And he turned and he said, I don't care about anything that has to do with the census. Don't talk to me about it and leave me alone. He was very animated. I cut out a few of the words that he used to describe his sentiment towards the census and the government. But one of the things that he mentioned that is seared in my memory now is he said, I work tirelessly and I pay my taxes. And I got not one penny from the federal government for this stimulus check. And this was around the time when all the information was being spread about the $1,200 stimulus checks that were being sent out. But conveniently, millions and millions of Latinx people were left out. And those were predominantly people who were undocumented. And so this individual had a right to be angry, had a right to be frustrated, had a right to be indignant about the fact that he works tirelessly, he contributes to his community, he pays taxes, and yet in his most desperate moment, in the most desperate moment for so many of us, he was not counted. He was not considered worthy enough to be supported by our federal government. And so I think that this story conveys so much of what we've had to work to overcome in our communities to achieve an accurate count in the midst of so many hurdles that we're trying to overcome. One of the fundamental questions that I think has caused so much strife, and for us has been both a challenge and an opportunity, is very early on in this process, the president made it a priority to fundamentally challenge whether or not people who are undocumented should be counted in the census. And this is, for generations, people who aren't citizens have been counted in the census. But he was asking the question, are Latinx people who don't have citizenship in this country worthy of being counted? And to us at CSPL, this is not only a political question, but it's a deeply human and faith-driven question. We as a faith-based organization believe that every single person is created in the image and likeness of God, that everybody counts. And so for us, encouraging communities to be counted in the census is not simply a civic duty, but it's an act of political and spiritual resistance at this time. And when we've talked to some folks, and I've talked to folks in my family about this, who said, well, I don't know if I want to fill out the census because I'm just doing what the government wants me to do. And I've said, why do you think the president and the administration is going through everything that it's been attempting to do if they didn't want you to fill this out, or if they did want you to fill this out? And so it became very clear to them that some in the federal government are doing everything in their power to dissuade us from filling out the census. And so what does that, ask of us then? Are we to submit to that, or are we to engage our communities in being counted? And in declaring, in so doing, that we count, that all of us count, that our children count, that our grandparents count, that our families count, that students who are Latinx count, that regardless of whether we have documents or not, we count. We are human beings and we're in this country and we're not going anywhere. And so I think that's been at the forefront of this struggle for so many during the last several months. And the federal government has tried time and time again to make this citizenship question something that is present on the census, and they failed at that. But what they haven't failed at is instilling tremendous, tremendous fear in our communities around whether or not their information is going to be shared with ICE, with other, law enforcement agencies that could potentially threaten their safety and security. And this stuff goes far back. And this is the other major barrier that I wanted to talk about, is the significant distrust between communities and our government. Not only our federal government, but local governments who've in some instances cooperated with ICE, have provided ICE with detailed information about families and their residences. We see on the nightly news and in our newspapers and across our social media accounts, constant news about the deportation of families, of fathers, of mothers, of young people who've made this country their home. And for so many, this has caused, rightly so, profound distrust. And for years, immigrant rights activists, immigrant rights coalitions have rightly encouraged immigrant households to be very cautious and careful about how they share information about themselves, about who they open the door for, because ICE and these federal agencies have gotten very crafty and conniving in terms of how the lengths they're willing to go to arrest and deport people. And so, for years, we've encouraged folks to be careful about who you open the door for, about asking very detailed information. And so now many organizations, we're encouraging folks to open their doors when it comes to somebody who's there to count them in the census. And so there's a lot that we have to overcome. And for us, I think we try to come back to the fundamental importance of the census, which is it's essential that we're counted, that we've got to do everything in our power to resist being invisibilized, to being erased, that if we're not counted, the resources, the support systems that are meant to be there to support our communities are going to be reduced, are going to be removed. All those things that Kassandra spoke about. And so, we've got the distrust against the government, rightly so, that we've got to work to overcome when it relates to the census. This fundamental question about who counts, which is undermined so much when it's come to the federal government's attempt to instill fear in our communities about this question of citizenship, which is not on the census. All the fear mongering, the lies, the political interference has done so much to make this period so much more difficult. And still, there's attempts to politically interfere in the census. There was a recent temporary restraining order issued by a district judge who was trying to extend the deadline of the census. The census just a few weeks ago was reduced by an entire month. For months, we had been planning, that October 30th was the deadline. So all along, organizations across the country, including CSPL, were planning and strategizing that October 30th was the time in which we had to really reach our communities as much as possible. And yet that was rolled back by an entire month, which is incredibly, incredibly challenging to deal with when we're dealing with all the things that the pandemic has presented. And so we've had to deal with political interference, with the lies, with the fear mongering, with the distrust. Then all of this, to lay over all of this, the layer of the pandemic, you know, the mandatory quarantining, which has been essential to keeping our community safe, the lack of in-person gatherings. Prior to the pandemic, we were in churches. We were talking with folks. We were organizing gatherings. You know, these leaders from CSPL that I spoke of, and we'll be looking at some photos of them in a little bit, they were organizing gatherings and educating people, and had organized workshops and educational forums on what the census is, why it's important. You know, just before the mandatory, you know, the state issued state of emergency in Illinois, of course. Before that was issued, we had an event at a parish in Maywood, Illinois, and we had over 200 people there, educating them all on the census. We would have continued doing that. Our jobs would have been a lot easier. But we understood that folks needed to stay home during this period of time, that in many ways they still do. We've got to take precaution to keep our community safe. In fact, Latinx communities in many states have been the hardest hit. So we can't let up on making sure that we protect one another and our families. So all of this has contributed to an environment in which we've had to work twice as hard. We've had to tap into every ounce of resolve within ourselves. We've had to be creative. We've had to be dynamic and thinking about new and innovative ways to go about this work. And we have, you know, those folks that I lifted up, including Kassandra, who worked with us over the summer, have done a lot. But we've got to take advantage of this window of opportunity over the next 10 days. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to my partner, Kassandra, to talk about what in fact we have done, which hopefully will inspire you all to think a little bit about perhaps what you can do.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm just gonna talk about it, but also show some pictures so you guys can kind of get an idea of everything CSPL has been doing, kind of leading up to the deadline for the census. Paloma, can I get access to a screen share? Thank you. So I already kind of touched on it, but CSPL has been doing phone banking, and this was honestly the best way to reach people in these communities in the Chicago area, in Maywood, Melrose Park, during the pandemic, just because no one was able to go out. So we did calls in Spanish and in English. There was a bunch of volunteers from the area. There was different college students. We were able to get some other Notre Dame students to help us out as well. And it was just a really great way, I think, to kind of do some outreach within the community. And also I think it was really helpful because people were kind of able to ask us any questions they had about the census, or if they had any hesitations. Like Michael said, a lot of the calls that we were getting with the Spanish-speaking community, a lot of them had fears about there being a question about citizenship. And they said that that's why they weren't filling it out, because they weren't comfortable disclosing that information. So I think it really helped to kind of calm some of these fears in the community, but also for the people that weren't able to find their forms in the mail, it was good to kind of direct them to the different ways they could fill out the census. And it was also just, I think, really helpful for the community to receive a phone call during the pandemic, because a lot of them had just been closed up in their homes for so long that I think it really helped to just have that human connection. And it was just a really great way to reach out to the community. Another big thing that we focused on with CSPL was the social media outreach. Again, this was a really great way to reach out to these people because we couldn't really do anything in person. So we hosted a couple of Facebook Live events. We had one in Spanish, we had one in English, where we kind of went through what the census was, but then also why it was important, and answered any questions that people might have had about it. And then we also did some video interviews, again, just really trying to get the word out about the census and why it's important to everyone. And then one of the other things that happened with CSPL is they launched a podcast this summer, and it's called Parting the Waters. They also have a Spanish version called Separando Aguas Turbulentes, and they were able to discuss the census, among other things. And again, just really trying to emphasize why it's so important for all of our communities, our Latinx communities, that it's, even during the pandemic, this is something that was so easy to do. The census takes 5 to 10 minutes to fill out. And just, we really wanted to get that point across. And then Michael can talk about some of the public events that CSPL was able to do during this time.
Thank you, Cassandra. I also want to mention Cassandra being humble. She didn't bring up that she was a key part of the phone banking effort. And in fact, I think Cassandra had recruited several ILS students or Notre Dame students to participate in that. And so they contributed to our overall goal. I think, Cassandra, I remember you working with Meg to organize a training and getting students trained for that. So thank you for all the work that the ILS students have done to contribute to this overall effort. And the graphic that Cassandra showed was one that I think she or Meg helped create. But to date, we've made 40,000 calls. My colleague Meg just updated me today. So that's 40,000 phone banking calls since April, which is just remarkable. And so some of what we've done since the weather warmed up over the summer and the late spring, when we began to feel like we could go outdoors, we've resisted doing anything indoors because we've always said we've got to prioritize people's health and safety right now. So anything we do outdoors, we're doing as safely as we can with face mask, hand sanitizer. And so we tried to think creatively. You know, some of the folks in this picture, I see Maria, Rose, Anna, Lula, Meg, and others, even some of their younger daughters there as well, participating and volunteering. We've done events to try to provide the community with essential goods that they need during this time. So, you know, we've partnered with churches, with partners like the Quinn Community Center, with local churches in the area, with universities. This is a pre-pandemic picture, so we're not gathered without mask indoors. But we were, you know, recently we've worked over the last few months to provide free face masks and PPE, free food supplies in partnership with other organizations. Recently, we organized a back to school drive outdoors where we provided backpacks with free supplies for e-learning at home. So we provided USB drives, we provided free headphones, we provided gift cards, just trying to think about any way we can reach families during this time. And so we've been able to register a lot of people, and we've held well over 24 events in the last few weeks and months. We've reached a lot of people, but obviously there's a long way to go, not just in our area in Illinois, but across the country. And I know there's countless organizations working out there. One of the other things that we did at CSPL is we worked with Loyola's Stritch School of Medicine in the hospital there to launch free COVID testing in 2 villages and areas that had not had consistent testing sites available. And so on the other end of the testing site, we worked with Loyola again to make sure that there was a pediatrics van. And it was there that we were encouraging families to fill out the census. Some of the other things that we've done recently is we've been organizing pop-up events outside of laundromats in order to, you know, catch families as they go in to do their laundry on a Saturday or Sunday. So this has required a lot of weekend work from our team. And recently, you know, we've done a few press conferences where we just are working to get the word out to the media, to the Spanish-speaking media, to the English-speaking media outlets. And so we've got a press conference planned for this upcoming weekend with a congressman in our area. And so these are the things that we've been doing over the last few months to really encourage participation. Again, the team at CSPL deserves a ton of credit for everything that they've done. But those have really been the major kind of strategies that have guided our work over the last few months, both through phone banking, the social media outreach, as Cassandra spoke of, and and the in-person events. So now we'd like to talk a little bit about what we can do, all of us, what we can do over the last 9 to 10 days here before the end of this month. So I'll hand it to Kassandra first.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so as we said, we have until September 30th to turn in our census responses, and that's next Wednesday. So some things that we can do leading up to that is, for one, you can contact 5 family members, friends, or neighbors and encourage them to take those 5 to 10 minutes to fill out the census. Again, it's super quick. That could be something you're doing, in the morning while you're drinking your cafecito. It's not going to take long, in between commercials, while you're watching something, things like that, be available to do that. And you can do it between classes and it won't take too much of your time. Another thing, as university students, we can make announcements about the census and the deadline coming up in our dorms. We can do it during hall council events or section meetings, things like that. Something super quick, but just a quick reminder sometimes really helps people out. You can also make an announcement about it before or after class. Again, just reminding people that deadline is coming up. And then if you think about it, if you tell 1 or 2 other people, they're going to tell 1 or 2 other people, and you're going to be able to get a really good outreach by just doing something as simple as making a quick announcement about the census.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we want to encourage all of you. Many of us are on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I know some probably use TikTok as well. I know that you can't download it in a few days, so if you want to use that, you better get on it. But sharing the information about the census through your social media platform is one of the best ways we can reach other people these days, because that's where we have our widest reach in many cases. So we've been doing a lot of that work at CSPL, as Kassandra spoke about. We've been posting countless memes and informational items on our Facebook, on our Instagram, on our Twitter. And the other thing is that I wanted to encourage you all to do is to share this information with your family and friends, but to also visit our website or another trusted community website where you can go to find out information about the census. On our website, we've got key questions that we've worked to address and answer, both in English and in Spanish. And so I'm going to share this information here with you all. But again, I would encourage all of you to share information about the census on your social media platform and to educate yourself. If you have questions, you could visit our website. You could also go to census2020.gov and learn more about the census in order to help your family and friends be able to fill out the census. It's up to all of us. We all have a role to play here. It takes no more than 5 to 10 minutes to fill out the census. And so we can all do our part. So with that, I think we'd like to hand it back to Luis and Paloma to answer any questions that any of you may have.
All of you that have joined us here today live, you may use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. You may also use the chat that is now open to not only panelists, but the rest of the attendees here today. To get things rolling, Michael and Kassandra, thank you so much for that very informational presentation. Could you tell us some concrete ways that these census numbers are used in people's neighborhoods or in people's counties that they live in? Who needs that data and how does it actually affect people?
Kassandra, would you like to take it?
Yeah. So I think kind of one of the things I think about is just going back to representation. But also I know when we think of representation, there's different, forms of representation thinking about in the government, but something as small as like businesses. So the idea that these businesses get access to the census data, and they are able to kind of see how they can best provide not only services, but also products to this community. So thinking about maybe here in like the South Bend area, I hear it a lot. People, you know, a lot of the university students who are moving here for the first time are like, there's not that many, you know, like Latino products in the stores that are around here, things like that. But I don't think they realize that the census data is used to kind of determine what products are going to be sold in stores. Something as small as that is directly kind of how we can see the census data in action. The same exact way we've seen the growth in like the Latinx community here in South Bend. We really want to reflect that in the census. Obviously, the people who are filling it out are university students. Most of them probably aren't from the area, but that's going to affect their communities back at home, right? So again, even if there are people who are from predominantly Latinx communities, you want to continue to reflect that in the census, because if everything's going to change again in the next 10 years. So you don't want to think that, oh, our data is already there from the past time we filled out the census. It's constantly changing. So you want to keep it as up to date as possible. But again, it also affects your representation in the government. So the number of seats that you have in the House of Representatives is determined by the data that we receive from the census. So which is why I really want to emphasize that, because I know there's a huge emphasis to vote, and if you can vote, you should vote, but also for our communities who are undocumented, but also our members of our community who are permanent residents and can't vote, the census is a really great way to kind of have your voice heard in the government.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, you know, to put this in like very specific terms as an example, say a community has 1,000 residents, that we know they've got 1,000 residents, but in the census, only 50% of people are counted. That's 500 people who are counted out of 1,000. That means only 500 people are accounted for when the schools receive funding, when the hospitals receive funding. So only enough funding to cover half of the residents is adequately provided. So the census in very real and tangible ways affects school funding, hospital funding, funding for street improvements, for parks, even for student federal aid. You know, if X number of students, in reality, if 100 students graduate from high school in a particular area, and they plan to go off to college in their local area, and yet only 50 of those 100 students were counted, that means that those 100 students are each going to receive a smaller share of federal funding than they might otherwise have been eligible for if there was an accurate census account. And I want to reemphasize the federal representation that Kassandra brought up. It is so critical. We've lost many, many seats in Congress because of this. In Illinois, you know, we're possibly looking at losing another seat as well if this census doesn't go as planned or as hoped.
Yes, we have another question here. After the census is complete, is there a way of telling how accurate the data is, or a way of estimating how many people might have been missed?
So this was something I was just reading up on the other day. There's a lot of fear right now about how accurate the census is going to be this time around. Because of the amount of time that it's been cut back short, and because of all the circumstances surrounding the difficulty of getting an accurate count, particularly, I think, and I think there's so many unique reasons for this within Latinx communities that I shared a bit about earlier and that Kassandra touched upon as well. But part of the other challenge is once all the data is collected, and the deadline currently is September 30th, as far as we know, unless there's some federal issued order that's set to remain in place, unless it's extended back to the original October 30th date. But right now the Census Bureau is looking at a 3-month window to adequately count and track all of this data. So we're talking about data that represents millions and millions of people being accurately counted in 90 days. And people who've been involved with the census for generations are saying this tight window presents incredible challenges in terms of reaching an accurate count that experiences as few errors as humanly possible. that it just makes the stress and the anxiety around not only counting accurately, but going through and combing through that information accurately far more challenging and daunting than it otherwise would have been.
Our next question is, who decided that the deadline would be cut short by 1 month and why?
So as far as we know, the Census Bureau received profound pressure from the federal government. And I think it's probably no mystery to say that the president and the president's allies have attempted all along to undermine the census and an accurate count, particularly in hard to count communities, which are Latinx communities, Black and African American communities, Native American communities, because, you know, according to political trends, these communities have generally voted more in favor of Democrats in elections, and so, you know, reducing the amount of representation that these communities have in Congress is, unfortunately, it seems, a political goal of undermining the census. And so the Census Bureau decided to roll back the census timeline by a month back in August. And it came as a shock to us who had been planning all along to extend our strategy and outreach until the end of October. And so a federal judge, I believe in California a few weeks ago, issued an order or an attempt to extend it back to the October 30th original deadline. I believe there was a temporary restraining order issued by a U.S. district judge in the Northern District of California about 2 weeks ago on September 5th. The challengers on this that had led this, one of which was the National Urban League, had filed an emergency request in order to extend the deadline to the end of October. So there's a larger coalition that's been part of this effort to extend the deadline back to October 31st. But I think as it stands this moment, the September 30th deadline is proceeding.
Thank you. Could you talk about how the census protects information of those who fill it out so that folks will not feel threatened by filling it out, especially undocumented people?
Yeah, so the responses, everyone's response to the 2020 census is protected by law. So under Title 13 of the US Code, the US Census Bureau cannot release any information that identifies you individually. Also, every Census Bureau employee and contractor is sworn for life to always protect your information. So that's kind of the law is what protects what you say. So again, there should be no fear to fill it out, regardless of what your citizenship status might be.
Can you talk again about what students can do in the next 9 days on campus and off campus to try to get the numbers accurately reflected for the Latinx community?
I'll defer to you, Cassandra.
Yeah, so I think the easiest thing to do, I know a lot of my family members use Facebook. That's what they're most active on. So even if it's something as simple as Michael said, sharing information about the census and why it's so important, specifically to the Latinx community, but also you can send them a message, you know, maybe just reach out to your tias and tios and all of that, and just remind them, ask them, have you filled out the census? And if they haven't, maybe talk to them about why it's so important for our communities, especially thinking about really remind them the fact that it affects us for the next 10 years. So, you know, some of us might be starting families then, and that's just, again, going back to like the fact that it is funding for our education. It determines funding for that, but also for our communities and things like that. It's so important that we try to get everyone's response to the census. So simple things like social media outreach is something we can all do from anywhere. But again, also, even if you're off campus, trying to just kind of talk to your neighbors in your apartment complexes. Something as simple as just being like, hey, have you filled out the census? And making yourself available if they have any questions or if there's any hesitations, really kind of be there for them and be a resource that they can go back to if they need any help. because again, it takes 5 to 10 minutes, but it's going to affect us for the next 10 years.
In practical terms, are there any restrictions on folks taking their personal iPad and signing people up in front of the grocery store or, you know, a coffee shop? Are there any rules that other citizens can help other citizens log in and do it?
No, we in fact encourage people to help one another out. You know, as long as the information is accurate, we all have to do our part to support one another. One of the challenges that many people encounter in Latinx communities are the language barriers. And you can take the census in Spanish. You know, there's a multitude of language options available on the census website. But what's challenging oftentimes is so much information that's shared out there, encouraging people to take the census or answering key questions about the census. These resources often are in English. And so, we've done our part at CSPL to try to provide everything that we can in Spanish and in English. But to go back to that question, Paloma, all of us can do that. We can pull out our phones. In fact, when we were in quarantine, I was with my in-laws, and I pulled out my phone because I saw the census form come in the mail, and I sat down with my mother-in-law, and we went and did census together, and it took us no more than 5 minutes. And that's what it takes. We've all got to do our part, especially to support our elders and those who have more fear and concern surrounding this.
Well, thank you very much. Professor Fraga, would you like to close our event today?
Sure. Thank you very much, Michael and Cassandra. Can we take a moment and clap to thank them for their excellent presentation and information, and especially for their inspiration to all of us. Thank you, Michael and Cassandra. Just want to let you know that this is the second of our events in the celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. We have at least 8 more events that we're organizing. We have a poetry reading tomorrow by Susie Garcia. We have a presentation on art and social change, race, gender, and migration in Puerto Rico by 2 of our ILS affiliated faculty fellows, Maricel Moreno and Tom Anderson. And if you go to latinostudies.nd.edu, you can see all of the events, sign up for all of the events as well. Also, all of these events are being recorded and will be made available for public viewing through our ILS website. So if you weren't able to hear the presentation today, or you had to leave, or you hear about another presentation later, please know that you'll be able to hear these presentations, I guess, for a significant period of time. And this is all part of our contribution of ILS enriching the intellectual experiences of our Notre Dame community and sharing those experiences with all who are interested in supporting Latino communities. We thank our community partners and organizational partners and leaders like Michael. We thank Cassandra, our student, very much for supporting and participating in this effort. We look forward to seeing you on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week.